Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the January 2021 edition of SM Advanced Forum. My name's Don Robinson. Over the next hour, I will be joined by regular co-hosts Tim, Mark and Eric to have an informal, well, we're not sure if Mark's turning up or not, but he's tied up with babies. We'll come back to that in a minute. Tim, Mark and Eric to have an informal chat with a reasonably expert eye across some of the latest developments in and around the business and technology of streaming. To stir the pot each month, we'll be joined by two guests. This time it's the turn of Robert Reinhardt and Nathalie Lethbridge, who we'll come to in a few minutes. Do get involved in the chat room. If you're joining live, we always enjoy your input. But before we come to the guests and ask them to kick off the discussions, we always spend a few minutes catching up with what we regular hosts have been occupied with. This month, I'm personally itching to talk about my latest adventures with weather satellites and SDR, but to keep me in check at this point, it is tradition for me to hand control to Tim. Tim, I can see Eric laughing in the background there. Tim, are you out there? How was your festive season?
I am out here. My Christmas season was actually really quite nice. We didn't quite get to buy, so Michelle and I got married this year. We have two little girls, and her tradition is to buy Hallmark Christmas ornaments that are of the Star Wars variety. Turns out we didn't have time to actually do that before Christmas this time, so we got them all at half price afterwards, and she got me a tiny little arcade version of Joust, which was a game that you flew around on ostriches with lances and you tried to stab other people. It was circa 1985, I think, from my childhood. So that was Christmas. That was good. Also bought a trencher yesterday, and Eric and I Eric's laughing because it's actually part of the Help Me Stream research group. I'll explain that perhaps later. I don't want to go into too much detail on that, but anyway, speaking of Eric, laughing at both you, Dom, and myself, Eric, how are you doing up in Wisconsin?
Well, I mean, I could talk about taking down the Christmas tree if you want me to talk about that. Just was doing that before the call, which was always fun because my wife wraps the lights around the branches like she's a junkie wrapping off her arm for, anyway. But no.
Big glows, yeah.
I thought we were going to talk about what we've been up to professionally, and so
go for it.
But I just want to throw out there that Tim and I actually have been working on the 2021 spring state of streaming survey for Streaming Media, which we just posted on the StreamingMedia.com website the other day. We will be taking responses until the first week of February 8th, I believe. Fill out the survey. Enter into a chance to win an Oculus Quest VR 2, and we'll be talking about the results at Streaming Connect in February, mid-February. We're having a virtual event. We have our typical Streaming Media East and West, which of course were both virtual in 2020. We just confirmed Streaming Media East, which was set for Boston in May, will also be virtual this year. We are still knocking on my desk right now, hoping to have Streaming Media West in Huntington Beach in October. Lord willing and the creek don't rise, as they say, maybe down where you live.
Where I live in Tennessee.
But we will be having a virtual Streaming Media Connect in February. In fact, Robert Reinhardt will be presenting several workshops there. And maybe with that, I can pass it over to Robert and we can introduce him.
Like letting off one of the sound effects buttons at that point.
And before we go to Robert real quick, Eric, talk about the fact that this is our third state of streaming in the course of a year and why we've done that. Because people, I'm sure, will look at it and go, wait, there's another state of streaming survey that you want me to take?
Right, and we launched the first one. Actually, we started it at the end of 2019, right, Tim? And we, for a variety of reasons, that didn't get published until early 2020. In fact, we published it about a couple of weeks after most of the world went into lockdown. So we had to put a qualifier in the report saying that these responses, these numbers, this data comes from a pre-COVID time. It became obvious that the effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns radically changed everything in the streaming media business, and so we thought it was an opportunity to check in on that and do a second state of streaming survey, autumn 2020. We presented that at Streaming Media West, and of course, things are not as different as we thought they were going to be, but we're still seeing the effects of COVID and the pandemic and how our industry is adapting to that, both in the short term and the long term. So at least for the foreseeable future, we're looking at doing these state of the streaming industry surveys every 6 months.
And I would add to that the fact that we thought when we did the second one in autumn of 2020 that, we'd come out of winter and the lockdowns and it was getting back to normal. But as you say, Eric, clearly we're sort of back in that same model now. And so we're asking people almost a year on from when we did the original one, hey, your business may have ramped up during 2020. Do you see the same thing going forward into 2021 in terms of ramp up or in terms of business continuity issues and that type of thing?
Right, and there's also the economic side of things as well. Of course, people took the opportunity to sign up for additional services as we get further and further into people being stuck at home, but perhaps not feeling as flush with money as they might have been at the beginning of the pandemic, or dealing with the effects of long-term unemployment. Are we going to see a drop in subscriptions? Are we going to see a drop in the number of services subscribed to? And I had to laugh, Tim, you mentioned Star Wars earlier, and I need to apologize for my son playing with his new lightsaber in the background. Isaac, please shut my door.
Yeah, I made the mistake before Michelle and I got married of buying lightsabers for the girls. And that was a bad idea because it turns out you can use that to beat more than just somebody else with another lightsaber. You can use it like a hammer.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Robert, one of your comments was that you wanted us to add hockey to the sports list in the survey. That means you're not in the United States. So where are you at the moment?
I'm in Canada. I'm on Salt Spring Island specifically, which is located between Victoria and Vancouver. So I'm just a short ferry ride away from either of those cities. And but I've been working remotely like this for well over a decade. So COVID hasn't really changed my work style, but it certainly has had an impact on my live streaming business. And that I would say, I don't know if this is the time to go into just quick introductions, but my business is largely divided between live streaming production and software development for video solutions, whether that's encoding optimization, as I was explaining pre-call, building pay-per-view systems for any range of problems that are out there. But my live streaming business has definitely taken the biggest hit with COVID. And it'll be interesting to see, tools like Zoom have democratized video conferencing, and I think it's going to have the same impact that digital photography did on commercial photography. People are just going to see that, we could do this on our own, and we don't necessarily need to hire teams to build a webcast for us because, people are getting used to reduced production quality. But without going into any topic specifically, I dub myself a video solutions architect. I am an American by birth, and for a lot of my time on this earth, I was in the United States. But happy to be here. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm excited to see where we're going to go.
So I have to ask, you grew up in the Midwest, if I remember correctly. Did you play hockey as a kid, or did you just get the hockey religion when you moved to Canada?
It's funny you mentioned that. I grew up like, I would say, most kids in the United States that I occasionally went ice skating, but I certainly didn't play hockey. I mean, where I grew up, hockey was almost the same as like my daughter doing equestrian. It was very specific. Like you had to have the parents and resources to want to take you to the ice rink. It's something that Canadians just sort of grow up with. So it's very much a part of their daily life. I actually only really learned how to skate in my first year of university in Toronto. There were public ice rinks, and all my friends in Toronto, which were all Canadian, were like, "You don't know how to skate well? Well, we're going to change that." And so, I really, it's like my wife only got a license to drive in California. Like, she learned how to drive in LA when she was 26. Like, that's a great place to learn how to drive,
Well, it's funny because I grew up on the Canadian border in New York, and when I was 3 years old, I desperately wanted Bauer skates for Christmas. That's what I wanted. And I got them, and then we moved south, and I got introduced to this thing called roller skating, in which I constantly fall on my posterior because it's completely opposite of the way that you ice skate.
I've now got a picture of your leg warmers, Tim.
Yeah, doing the flash dance thing. So, anyway, all right. So thank you, Robert. Now we're going to jump back across the pond to just about an hour north of Dom. Nathalie, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're located in London, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm in London in the midst of its, at the beginning of its third lockdown. I have a background in both TV and streaming. I've been in streaming for about 12 years. All the way back from the early days, and my area of focus across the globe is really on content monetization, and obviously streaming, and what's happening in that world. So things have been up and down in the last year with the COVID. Obviously, for some people it's been really tough. For others, and including those who are planning launches, who are a bit concerned about launching under the new circumstances. I've also seen in my industry a lot of the big players launching major services. So it's been a kind of a wild ride this year, as you say. It's like you can't take anything for granted.
Definitely. And we'll come back to that topic here in just a minute, because that's a topic that I think is of interest to everybody on the call.
Yeah.
Robert, I want to come back to you real quick. You were known as the Flash Doctor for a period of time, and that had nothing to do with the Nutcracker version in Boston. So Flash is officially dead, not just mostly dead like in The Princess Bride, but really dead. And we're not going to go through its pockets and look for spare change, like Billy Crystal said we should do in The Princess Bride. But what do we do with Flash now that it's dead, but a bunch of us are still constantly getting requests for updates, to update Flash Player on our devices?
Well, unless you're, in technology like I am, and you need to debug something, you should certainly uninstall Flash on every machine that you have. I mean, there's no reason to keep it on there anymore. Browsers won't allow it. Increasingly, it's not even an option to enable it, so it's just best to get rid of it. I cautioned in a brief LinkedIn post that make sure you're going to official Adobe instructions, because I imagine, especially if you're one who's prone to, get your content elsewhere, you want to be careful of fake uninstallers, because they'll likely install something really horrible on your machine. In fact, while we started this call, I got a reminder from the Flash Player installer to uninstall. So it was pretty funny. It popped right up over the Zoom. I'm not making that up. I still have the window here. I can do a screenshot. But and the only reason I actually have it on this particular MacBook Pro is for debugging legacy solutions that are still being supported. So, the crazy thing is that just because our modern computers and browsers don't support Flash, there's a lot of people still running old versions of operating systems in really old browsers where Flash will run perfectly, right? If the operating system and the browser, aren't prompting you to do this, and that's one reason why Adobe's own installer will prompt you to uninstall it. You can still be using it. I've got plenty of old Windows machines that are, out of end-of-life operating systems that will still run Flash. So, and I've got a client that does cattle auctions. Those guys, and they are largely guys who are selling and buying cattle, they're on really ancient computers, just like a lot of government is on really old machines. And so it's really important to just take that extra step on your own to uninstall Flash. And if you are using Flash and you need help migrating it, let me know. I'll help you with that.
And it's funny that you mentioned the cattle buyers, because Michelle and I bought a farm and we're actually going to be raising cattle. That tells me that I need to pull out one of my old computers so that I can fit in, rather than going up with a fancy, MacBook Air Silicon or something.
Wow.
But
so am I going to be able to order beef from you? Like, is that something that's going to be an option in the future? Can I get some Tim Siglin beef?
Yeah, I'll send it to Tim Hortons, and then you go to Tim Hortons and you actually eat it there. That's how that'll work. So anyway, but there are still websites that have, you're talking about old operating systems, old machines. There's still websites that have Flash on them. What happens to those sites? Obviously, people with modern browsers, will get an error if they go there, especially if there's no failover. People on older machines, are they going to actually be able to still use those sites, or will that functionality cease as well?
Yeah, Adobe hasn't programmed anything to explicitly just not make Flash Player work, right? You have to uninstall it. The thing that's officially happening now is that Adobe's just not going to release updates, right? So there's, and they were releasing updates still on a pretty regular basis. I don't know how many they released in 2021, but several. And they're largely to address security vulnerabilities. So if people are hacking the player code, or hacking an attempt to use the player to hijack your machine, then they'll exploit it. It is funny. There's a product I use on my boat to add a sheen to it that keeps the metal from oxidizing, and their site still has a Flash movie to play a video on how to use that product, and I've even emailed them. I offered them for free to hey, I'll convert that real quick. It's a really small video, whatever. That is not a good thing to keep doing. So it'll be interesting to see. Most of the sites that continue to invest in their Flash legacy systems were more real-time sites, things that WebRTC was still playing catch-up on for the last several years, and it was a slower rolling beast than it was to have Flash solutions back in the day. So it'll be interesting to see how many of those, I've had any number of clients, from celebrity psychics to dating sites to cattle auction sites, that they put a significant amount of money into a Flash infrastructure and they made their money back, but they don't want to just sink another set of coin into building a replacement for it. So, and that's why most of them have stalled so long. They just didn't want to pump the money into it, and it couldn't have happened at a worse time with COVID, and budgets are tighter, obviously.
Sure.
So
Dom,
you've mentioned WebRTC a few times there.
I was going to segue to you to talk about this very thing, so please go on.
Okay, so you've mentioned WebRTC a few times there, and we on my side of the coin, we've had a lot of professional involvement with helping CDNs scale WebRTC and so on. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are and what you guys have been up to.
Yeah, to date, I haven't had to build my own scaling WebRTC infrastructure of server technology, even on the cloud. These days, as a video solutions architect, unless a client comes to me and wants to own their own WebRTC infrastructure, which I've had one ambitious client over the last 2 years who I've been involved with building out a rather large-scale WebRTC infrastructure, but they didn't build it from scratch. They're using other, licensed software, but it's running, completely within their own private cloud. And so it is one of the biggest problems with WebRTC is scaling it, because you can't use traditional HTTP caching infrastructure for that, right? It's just like RTMP. So for me, I see history repeating on several levels. We all remember when RTMP first came out, and I worked on projects when I was at Schematic, an interactive agency in LA, where we did projects with Disney, NBC, ABC, all the big broadcasters, and inevitably there was someone who didn't have the port 1935 open to play RTMP streams, because that was the default port. And so it took a while for corporate institutions to adopt this new RTMP infrastructure. We're in an even more complicated state with WebRTC because of the fact that UDP transmission is going to be the most low latency. It's going to be, if you want ultra low latency, you're going to be doing that over UDP, and that's just really complicated on most firewalls, right? And so that particularly if you're on a cell network, so there's just a lot of navigation around moving these video bits around. I mean, a lot of people think Zoom's using WebRTC. They built their own proprietary protocols to do what they're doing here, and it's interesting. I've had a couple of clients who are innovating in the WebRTC space. And using things like WebSockets to transport bits instead of ICE candidates and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see how the CDNs start to address this new world. I mean, I don't know if you remember, it was Tim O'Hare at the time, worked at Scripps Networks. He's no longer in the streaming business. He became a real estate agent in Tennessee, I think. But he was the first person in broadcasting who introduced me to the term the flash tax because of Adobe's licensing for Flash back in the day for RTMP. So it was costlier for CDNs to adopt Flash if they were going to use Adobe Media Server. It wasn't cheap. And WebRTC, thankfully, doesn't necessarily have a particular hold with a commercial entity, or I should say commercial entity doesn't have a hold on it, but it's still that problem of having to build all new infrastructure, or you're not going to really be able to piggyback HTTP caching infrastructures. And so what's interesting now, and I didn't bring this up in the pre-call, but it seems to be a WebRTC versus low latency HLS discussion right now. What do you really need for your low latency need? Or like, what are the business requirements around low latency, and then go from there? Because if you're doing a lot of one-to-many broadcasting, low latency HLS makes a lot of sense, but WebRTC makes more sense when you need to do group calls like this. You need to do any kind of like many-to-many broadcasting. That's gonna rely much more heavily on WebRTC than something like low latency HLS.
So I mean,
Robert, it's interesting.
Sorry, Tim. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Robert, I just finished up the State of Enterprise video, and in fact, that's one of the conversations I think that's happening now. Is the whole idea before was you did eCDNs, you did everything to help minimize what was going to go out across the VPN, and suddenly you've got everybody using the VPN, and there's a question as to who actually needs to participate in a call versus in an all hands versus who just needs to watch it. And so those models of not even necessarily needing significantly low latency for those people, if all they're going to do is just consume it as a viewer as part of it, as opposed to somebody who has to interact. It's the same problem we had in video conferencing when I was in that before I moved into streaming, was you have an 8-port MCU, you could only do 8 people actually actively talking back and forth, but you'd add an extra port on just to stream it out to all the people who wanted to at least, consume that particular experience.
So I was going to just chip in a little bit there on the scalability side. I think there are enormous challenges to scaling many of the different protocols actually, but in particular everyone's got lazy because of the dominance of HTTP in the CDNs. And I think WebRTC has presented some new challenges, but because edge computing is becoming the way that CDNs are increasingly deploying services, the ability to use a microservices architecture, certainly for one of our clients, meant that we could roll out WebRTC and give them the scaling that they needed across that infrastructure. So I think it would be a shame if WebRTC got pigeonholed as being something that was for many to many and for conferencing, because it is actually quite possible to do a very large. Oh, my volume's low on the YouTube stream apparently. I'll see if I can do something about that while I'm talking to you. But I think it's important that the technology doesn't get pigeonholed, because there are ways that it can be scaled, and they are commercially available at the moment. But I don't want to dwell on those because that's not the point of SMAF. So
no, yeah, and
go ahead, Robert.
It'll be interesting. Oh no, I was just one of the biggest differences between I think WebRTC, where it is now, and when Flash introduced RTMP well over a decade ago, is that we have the cloud resources we have today. I mean, you weren't able to spin up, like you were saying with microservices just a moment ago, you couldn't spin up and down services with the kind of control you do now on the cloud. And so even though WebRTC has this extra footprint on top, aside from HTTP, we now have the technology to really, like, you don't need to have a server running 24/7. That's huge to address, like, an audience that might be variable and really hits only during live streams, right? I mean, most of my clients don't want to keep running. If they know they have planned events and they only need it, like, why run a server for 24/7 when you only need it 2 hours a day? And so you're going to substantially decrease costs by having infrastructures that cater to that. And so that's the good news. I think that's where, I don't know if you were hinting at that, Dom, with what you were saying in terms of rolling out WebRTC.
We just rolled out a sort of upgrade to Limelight's real-time streaming platform, and it was a really interesting, significant project for us. They were having, I think, a lot of the engineering had come from the protocols and hadn't come from scalability, and so they needed to address the scaling challenges that they were having because they were getting a lot of interest. We spent the last year sort of re-architecting and replacing what they had and putting in a more scalable infrastructure. But it is fairly specifically for one-to-many streaming. But it's also quite, from our point of view, what you put in and what you pull out is reasonably interchangeable because of the way it's architected. So, and that's largely come because I think they've taken quite a compute approach to their infrastructure rather than a platform as a service view. And I think that culture is changing a lot in CDNs and promises.
And I'm going to do moderator's prerogative here and actually switch over to Nathalie. But one of the things that I want to use from that is you mentioned edge compute, and of course one of the things that we're seeing beyond just what you're talking about with WebRTC and low latency is the piracy mitigation factors that we're starting to see edge compute being beneficial
Absolutely.
for. Because if you can essentially segment down to knowing that the piracy is occurring off a particular edge, you can then add some features in there to really help sort of mitigate the piracy.
Absolutely.
So Nathalie, your focus is obviously, you talked about content monetization. Piracy is a huge part of content monetization, or the mitigation of it is. But let's step back and talk about the more traditional movie theater versus streaming premieres. You mentioned, of course, you had a number of big players, NBCU, HBO, who've stepped up their streaming services here. Where do we stand at the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, with streaming becoming the norm for doing premieres versus a year from now when we're back to normal, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a really big challenge because, as you know, the industry's always had a very rigid windowing system for its content that to some extent protected that theatrical window as the first ultimate experience. So from a business perspective, studios invested massive amounts of marketing on awareness for getting people into theatrical experience in the bricks and mortars of a theater. And of course, streaming has completely blown that out, and we've seen a collapse of that window because it started with Trolls 2 and others, where NBCU collapsed the window, so it was day and date. They went straight to streaming, and then of course we've seen HBO Max now saying its major releases for next year are going to be day and date with the streaming HBO Max in the US. And that's really significant because that's really starting to completely change that window. And so the feedback, so the theaters are concerned that means that it might take away audiences. And so they're investing a lot in technology to get the cinema experience to ramp up. But the question is it going to be just cannibalistic, or is it actually going to grow those audiences? And there's so much you can do, and I think that cinemas have been very blinkered in their approach to who their audience is. They've had very much a retail and bricks and mortars model, and and suddenly they've had to embrace digital transformation, which hasn't come easily for them. So I think, and the studios have been trying to negotiate this window for at least 10 years. 12 years ago, I was trying to do this on behalf of studios, and you just kept on being met with absolute resistance. The question is going to be, what impact is it going to have on monetization? Because the value of and what impact it's going to have on the spend on production, because to get people into those cinemas, you're going to have major big ticket experiences. So I think the learnings we have is that I think that cinemas are going to have to really partner much more strongly with studios and create and really focus much more strongly on the experiential aspect of what they have. On the other hand, studios have the ability to grow smaller films or indie films across bigger audiences by building up and ramping up the streaming presence and the marketing of those titles on the streaming services. If you look at the numbers for the streaming services, they're out of the box. So Disney is also got a very active strategy of streaming, of releasing first window on streaming to enhance the audience of Disney Plus. And I think we're going to have a lot of big ticket items, very experiential kind of box office type things going into movie theaters. But I think we're going to see probably more funding of indie and movies into direct to streaming.
Well, and it's interesting. There are a number of things you said that I want to come back and touch on, but one of the things you're talking about with day and date, Eric and I had a conversation the other day about the Pixar movie Soul. And in fact, I watched the little documentary on how they were able to accomplish doing production during the pandemic. In an article I wrote this morning for him, I actually referenced back to that because it was really quite clever. That model, when Soul came out, because they had already done Mulan and they had required an upcharge in Mulan, when I first saw Soul pop up, I thought, well, I'm going to have to wait 6 or 7 weeks to watch it because that's what I had to do with Mulan. I wasn't going to pay the $30 to watch it. Eric, I know you watched Soul. Did you pay the money up front to watch Mulan, or did you all wait that sort of windowed period of time?
We all waited, although that may have been more a function of the fact that nobody in the house except me and my wife really wanted her to watch Mulan. And in fact, early on in the, during the pandemic, we did pay for a couple of the VOD premieres of movies like I forget Onward and Trolls World Tour. And our thinking was, hey, for $30 or even $20 to rent, it's still cheaper than a night out at the theater would be.
Yep, that's the response that people have had. But in fact, they got the price sensitivity was less in the US than in Europe. People were much more price sensitive in Europe about the Trolls World Tour pricing. God pricing generally, people think it's a little high, but apparently in the US it didn't show a lot of sensitivity.
I mean, I think Hamilton honestly had more of an impact on Disney's subscriptions, and of course it was included with it, than Mulan did. I don't. Has Disney broken the numbers out yet to say here's what we made on Mulan on the premiere?
I haven't seen numbers. I mean, the challenge with streaming is that you don't get numbers as easily as you do with box office. The system hasn't been kind of put in place yet, but we know that's a good point. We should be getting numbers from streamers, and we should be able to get transparent data on these sorts of things. Absolutely, because how are they going to? If you get them, that's the problem. If you get them. I agree. I agree with you. I think they're not released very easily. You won't see Netflix or Disney or the major streamers.
Don, to Natalie's point, I think what it is because we've got large companies like Apple, we have large companies like Disney, have multiple business units. They're tending not to break out the numbers. Disney's obviously said streaming is the future, but they're going to tell you streaming is the future and we're doing really, really well.
Yep.
Maybe the way I look at it is until the numbers get up to where they're close to theatrical numbers, we won't really see that, because if Disney came out and said, we made $4 million in subscriptions on Mulan and it cost us $200 million to make, everybody's going to go, that's a flop. And honestly, I went to the movie theater. I was the only person in the movie theater to watch Christopher Nolan's Tenet for a showing. So
Really? Wow.
wear my mask because there was nobody else around me. But when those numbers came out, it was considered a flop if you're looking at it by 2019 standards. By 2020 standards, it was amazing that they got anybody to go to the theater as it stood.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to this thing of the audience and actually growing that audience by having that initial window be outside of that physical space, and what is cannibalistic for the people actually going to the theater and what's not. So there, you could release on streaming to geographical areas where there isn't a close proximity for a movie theater, and enhance your numbers that way, and try and devise a commercial model where the first window takings would be split between the streamers and the theatricals. So at the moment, the rights are so siloed that the theaters couldn't even grab some of the revenue from the SVOD.
Nathalie, right. Nathalie, I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier about a couple of things that I'd love you to follow up on with your thoughts. One was how brick and mortar theaters are going to have to reimagine and reinvent the experience to get people to come into the theater. And then you also mentioned that you think we might see more independent films move directly to streaming and bypass the theaters entirely. It seems to me that the brick and mortar theater, there are two types, well, there's several types, but two of the main types of experiences they provide are the big blockbuster surround sound recliners for the Marvel and Star Wars and Disney franchises, right?
Which, by the way, we all have 4K TVs at home now with surround sound systems, so there's
it's still not, I would say it's still not the same as being in the theater.
I get it.
Right. And then on the other hand, you have the independent movie fanatics who like the experience of the theater for very different reasons. How do you think movie theaters are, what sort of experiences, what sort of offerings, do you have any ideas?
What sort of offerings for the independents, you mean?
Let's start with the black, but well, across the board. I mean, what do movie theaters have to do to provide audiences what they're looking for?
I know for a fact they're investing heavily on the tech side, but I do think for the multiplexes there is, from a marketing perspective, they need to build something for the fandoms around all these big franchises, and there's not a lot there when you go to the actual Cineplex or cinema to actually keep you connected from a fan base. So any experience, and some of that may be digital and streaming services and others, or being able to, your consumer products experience, you could have e-commerce come into it much more heavily. You could have bundling and partnerships. It's pretty binary when you go into a major traditional cinema experience these days. It's basically popcorn and sodas and so forth. You have the smaller independents create more of an experience, but I think that's one thing. I think for the major franchises, really thinking about other business models they could bring into it, other experiences, using technology to create much more engagement and interactivity with the experience. There's a lot that can be done there, and paying attention to the fans and really trying to connect and communicate with them outside of just that big explosive experience of when you're in the cinema. At the moment, you walk into a cinema, you know, they have some cursory stuff online on Facebook or whatever, but there's no real sense of building the community and having it as a community place where you have an enhanced experience that you can't have from home, which is why they've been so threatened by this situation, because it's not as good, but it's good enough. You know, and so you start to talk about the cost as the differentiating factor, and that's not good. You need to have the experience be the differentiating factor, or people are just going to start to put you on their dispensable list.
Right. And if we're talking about, I think if we're talking about the blockbusters and the franchises, you know, over the last decade, there have arisen versions of Comic-Con in every major city and a lot of minor cities. Madison, Wisconsin, a city that I'm close to, population 200-some thousand.
It's very powerful.
Right, and so if there's a way to bridge that sort of in-person experience with actually seeing the films.
Of course, creating events, creating things that are worth getting out of your house and coming in and being part of that community. You're absolutely right. Why linear programming? What do you mean by that? Ah, that's really interesting. And I think you have two categories of cinemas, actually, particularly I know in Europe anyway. You have the big chains, and then you have the sort of independent cinemas and the art house cinemas and so forth. And they're actually moving into, I think, very different places. And the prediction is that the more art house, more smaller, bespoke will become, they'll start to become like a boutique experience, and that will protect what they do. But there's one, you know, it here, Curzon, that's actually got a streaming service aligned with it. So they were very early on that, and they've benefited from it during this period. So and they know who their audiences are. They know what they watch. They've got a CRM now that they can manage. Whereas you go to, I don't know, View Cinema, and you don't get the feeling that they have a CRM or even know who's walked in the door, other than the ticketing. So,
Well,
yeah, it's a community event. Yeah. And Yeah, I think they had a particular model, and they're really struggling to move away from that model. And also, I do think that the larger cinema chains, because of the financial implications and the implications on their resources, they just haven't had the bandwidth completely.
Well, and AMC yesterday announced, their CEO said that to survive 2021, even if they got stimulus money here in the States, he'd still need almost $500 million just to essentially pay the rents on the cinema locations. So it's to a certain extent, it's the problem that consolidation creates when suddenly, after you've consolidated, you have no product to sell.
And there's a lot of speculations about what's going to happen to those big chains, actually. And we've also got the expiry of the holdback, the Paramount clause, where studios can't own cinemas happening in the next year. So it's going to be very interesting with that financial precarity, what's going to happen. But you go into a cinema and you've had the same experience for 40 years now. They haven't changed the model. They haven't built new monetization opportunities other than popcorn and bad drinks and bad food. And this is the point, that bricks and mortars, they should be looking at the retail space and seeing how else can we engage and how else can we build up partnerships. And why aren't we allowing Comic-Con to have it, to come in and have everyone come on community events? And why aren't we leveraging YouTubers and doing first release windows for YouTubers for their longer term content? And but going back to that, we had a conversation earlier about visual storytellers and how they're looking at streaming now. That's an interesting area. So theaters, it's not just cinemas and the retail set based in cinemas, but theaters, actual physical theaters and performances and concert halls and so forth have also had to rethink how they monetize the storytelling that they're doing and how that they take it out. And streaming is the avenue for them.
If I can ask a question real quick, Nat, with Nathalie. I'm curious to hear more just about if you think if theater chains will be successful in finding those new opportunities. I quickly left to go find, like, during the holiday, Oda. I get these old El Paso taco kits, and on the other side of it, I can get 2 free digital rentals from Cineplex Odeon here in Canada. And so I thought that was interesting that they're advertising on taco dinners to try and get, and it just feels too much like Blockbuster, too little, too late. Like, really? You're going to try and enter this really crowded digital space, and why am I going to go to you for my content versus my existing outlets?
You're absolutely right, and I think marketing is one of the big areas that they're seriously challenged in. They've relied on the studios to do all the awareness marketing, and they haven't really, built up traditionally teams that do that. So you will see partnerships like the one that you've just talked about. We're seeing it, in Europe as well, where they partner with food delivery things and go Friday night in and, and try and make it up that way. But to do that, you've actually got to be able to have, some of them don't even have a streaming service that they can deliver to, so they're suddenly using Facebook and YouTube. And go back to our earlier conversation, that's not good if you're looking at privacy issues, and they've got all of their DRM requirements that can't be met. So, they're not going to be allowed to release that way. So, yeah.
One thing I wanted to also get your thoughts on, and you work way more closely with these distribution outlets than I ever would. But, last year I got my first, actually it was at the end of 2019, I got my first Oculus headset. Do you think that could be an outlet for theaters to sort of create more immersive?
Yeah, totally. The only problem is that it's quite a big expense, and it's not, the scaling of it has always been the problem. But, absolutely, if you go into that experience and, they've got, Oculus has the deal with Paramount that it's now had for about 12, 14 months, where you can actually sit in a cinema, in a virtual cinema experience, and experience it as if with your friends, as if you're all sitting in the same cinema. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that actually, if I am a theatrical distribution person, I would be saying, you know what, how can we restructure the business model so we can get a share of this, and we can actually drive our audience and your audience and build new audiences as a result of that actually makes everybody more money in the end and protects us. Embrace those sorts of experiences. So, create events where you can or have extra footage where you can use that as an acquisition tool to get people in the door or get people paying. I agree. I think that's exactly. I think VR is a complicated thing because of just, as not everyone likes to have something around their head, and it's not, as I said, it's not cheap. But absolutely, Facebook is definitely investing a lot in Oculus because of that. And again, you think about the Facebook community, you think about how you can create a big loop, and if you're in a cinema, and it's the opportunity is amazing.
So, Nathalie,
More of that.
Just a quick clarification when you talk about the art house cinemas over in Europe. Here we sort of have two groups of independent cinemas. One group is the ones who do second runs. So we'd call them dollar theaters, here in the States. You go pay $3 if you don't want to pay $15 in the main theater. You wait 4 weeks, you go watch it there. Those seem to have been hit especially hard. Then we have the actual art house or independents like you're describing.
Yep.
Do you have an equivalent of the second run theater in the UK and Europe?
Every country is different in the UK. That's what makes it weird. Certainly in France, for instance, you have a lot of second run theaters and smaller theaters, and in fact, really old movies where they run really old movies and things like that. There's a mix. You have, obviously the first window, big multiplexes kind of dominate the big sort of blockbuster types. And you have independents who do a combination of both. So they'll have some older titles and some newer titles mixed, and the indie art house ones who do multicultural kind of indie movies. Yeah, you do. It's but you still have. But just like the US, the multiplexes, they take up a lot of retail space. They're often very heavily tied into retail footfall for major wholesale or sale for major sort of malls and things like that, and they're kind of tentpole presence for those malls. So they are seriously challenged right now. I mean, and the mums and the smaller ones are challenged because, as you pointed out, they've got all these overheads and they have to pay the rent, and they just don't have the bandwidth. A bit like the guys that Robert was talking about earlier, they don't have the bandwidth to invest in tech to be able to create their streaming services, to be able to then use their rights, and the rights are different. They don't have those rights. So this probably needs a reinvention of or recalibrating of the windowing and the share of revenue throughout each windowing. But it really is dependent on them understanding their audiences and knowing what's going to be productive for them and how they can build revenue in the future.
One thing I found interesting here in the States, just as a final thought on this, is the dollar theaters or the indies tend to be in older theaters that had an actual theater stage as well as the screen, where of course multiplexes, if you tried to poke beyond that screen, it's just the back wall.
Yeah.
So a number of the indie in the States have started off, and this was even before COVID, but through that period of time, they're offering houses of worship to come in and use, say, on Sunday mornings during downtimes. They're offering it for graduation or birthday parties where you come in and, you have a place to do that, and then you also watch a movie together. do you see something similar in terms of reuse in Europe at this point?
Yes, I do. I think you need to pivot all your thinking about that and think about, what can this deliver in terms of audiences, and does it have to be an audience in entertainment? So there's two ways of thinking about that. One is the physical space itself. Can it be used and hired out for other things like religious services or whatever? And then the other is, if I'm investing in a performance and a theater performance in the theater, I'm effectively a storyteller. And what can I do to make that story's audience bigger and monetize it in a bigger and different way? So there was a small theater in Oxford recently that did a streamed services for they streamed and did an interactive element to a Christmas pantomime, which is what they have here in the UK. And they got a review in the New York Times, and they never in their wildest dreams would have thought but of course their audience blew out beyond the UK because of it.
Which actually, to your point about growing the audience with streaming, that is something that we can certainly do. Fascinating. Dom, I know we got just a couple minutes here. You wanted to talk about weather satellites or weather balloons, but I have no idea why.
There we go.
Is that plus sign at the bottom of England where you are, Dom? Because it sort of seems like it's fairly close.
That doesn't speak to any of your concerns for some kind of post-apocalyptic future coming that you're going to be using over the air here to pick up stray signals.
Given the fact that I now have a trencher, I can actually build really large antennas in the ground here in Tennessee. So. Yeah, so you and I were approached by somebody from Akamai who had actually read the Greening of Streaming article that we did back, in June. And he then pointed us toward Mike Matera, who's in sustainability at Akamai, who'd written a really interesting blog post about a region of Virginia that's about 200 miles from me, where they actually have gone fully renewable energy during the pandemic for their data center there. What was fascinating was they started this process 3 years ago, wanting to move toward fully renewable for that particular data center. Had no idea they would get slammed with the amount of bandwidth and traffic that they needed to during the pandemic, but were still able to hold the line and build that solar farm out big enough to be able to cover 100% there in Northern Virginia. I thought that was fascinating because, Dom, you and I have talked about the fact that streaming will grow significantly, and the fallback will tend to be, if it grows significantly, you'll fall out of using renewable energy sources and back to fossil fuels. But kudos to Akamai for having to go through that process.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, make American hamburgers great again is what I'm going for. So.